Thank you, Wayne County Chapter, for sponsoring this session. Hello, I'm Christina Yetzer-Drain, and this is Turning Research into Family Stories. Birth and death records, newspaper clippings, maps, land deeds, wills, photos, and family interviews. They're all pieces of a puzzle that can tell an ancestor's story. How can you weave a tale or tell a short story or publish a book that will interest even non-genealogists in the family? So why write a family story? It helps us to understand who we are. It connects us to those we never knew, allows us to share genealogy and family stories with family members, preserves our research for future researchers, establishes proof and discovers holes in research, and it connects family history in the context of local, regional, and national history. Think about who your audience might be: your children, grandchildren, your family, maybe your siblings, your aunts, your uncles, maybe even your parents if they're still living, a genealogy group, or to file in a genealogy room, local genealogists and historians, or the world. Maybe you have information that another family member doesn't have, and they'll find it through your writing. Let's talk about the different types of genealogical writing. There are proof arguments and case studies and reports, genealogical compilations such as pedigrees and lineages, narratives such as family stories and even house stories about the families that lived there. And there are life stories such as biographies, autobiographies, or memoirs. Don't forget to write about yourself when you're documenting genealogy. I was in the Air Force when it was still West Germany before the Berlin Wall fell. And then I got a chance to see the eastern part of Germany after the wall fell. Those are all stories that I've not really told my family, especially my children. And so I should write those down so that they have that memory. And photo books are also a different type of genealogical writing. Let's look at proof arguments. Proof arguments start with a focused research question, and it might be in three different categories: questions of identity, distinguishing the research subject from other individuals. An example of that might be people with the same name. It could be a question of relationships, focus on individuals who are related to the research subject. For example, identifying parents of a great-grandmother. They can also be questions of circumstance, focusing on specific situations or events. For example, researching the subject's immigration experience or military service. There are three types of proof arguments. Proof statements, they usually rely on one source. Proof summaries, several pieces of evidence are needed to draw a conclusion. And proof arguments in case studies indicates evidence and possibly conflicting evidence which needs to be resolved. All proof arguments must satisfy the 5 elements of the genealogical proof standards: a reasonably exhaustive research into a variety of sources, complete and accurate source citation, careful analysis and correlation, resolution of conflicting evidence, and a sound written conclusion. Genealogical compilations can include genealogies, pedigrees, and lineages. They document the relationships between people, provide biographical details about people, study the families in historical context, and they can include proof discussions to establish relationships and prove kinships. So let's begin with the end in mind. Where do you want to publish your work? You could publish it in genealogical or historical publications at the state or local level. If you have enough information about your family to prove your lineage, you could apply to a lineage society. You can also create photo books with stories. We talked about that a few minutes ago. That's a great place to place your history so that other family members can flip through and read about different people, their ancestors. Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.org also have areas where you can place written memories, you can put photos, documents in, and FamilySearch.org even has an area where you can audio record some of the family history. And then also consider blogs, websites, and other places where a wide variety of people, hopefully your relatives, will be able to see the information. And if you have enough information, you could always self-publish a book. OGS has a couple of publications that you might be interested in writing for. One is the Ohio Genealogy News, and the other one is the Ohio Genealogical Society Quarterly. There are also national publications where you may be able to get your work published. But don't forget your local chapters too. This article is of my second great-grandfather that I wrote for our local genealogical chapter website. The Ohio Genealogical Society has 5 lineage societies that you can apply to. First Families of Ohio, Settlers and Builders of Ohio, Century Families of Ohio, the Society of Civil War Families, and the Society of Families of the Old Northwest Territory. I'm a member of the Settlers and Builders of Ohio and Century Families of Ohio, and I'm working toward First Families and Old Northwest Territory. Ancestry.com has a public member area for photos and documents. This is a document that I found on my 4 times great-grandfather, John Green Troop. It talks about an Indian massacre that occurred when he was just a child. Unfortunately, we've never been able to prove this legend, so it's likely not correct, but it is included in Ancestry.com. FamilySearch.org has a wonderful place to keep memories. You can add photos, documents, stories, and audio. And you can see the beginnings of my page here, where I've added some audio, Joe's guilty pleasure. His guilty pleasure was baseball, although he was a star football player in high school and held records for a number of years. But his great love was baseball. I also have some documents. I have family stories. You can see some beautiful photos of my family through the years. Once you start compiling a lot of information, you might want to consider creating a blog or a website so that family that's across the country or maybe even across the world are able to see some of the work that you've done. Here I've included my Yetzer Family in America website that I created with Johann Baptist Yetzer and some of the family members, the first couple of generations. You may have enough information to publish a book or maybe an ebook. Here's some of the more popular places where you might be able to have a book printed or to place your book on Amazon. Lulu.com, Blurb.com, Amazon, CreateSpace, and 48hourbooks.com all have templates that you can use to help create your book. 48 Hour Books is actually in Akron, Canton area, so very easy to access within Ohio. Start small. Will you write about one person or a family? Is there enough information to write a story? And it's okay if there isn't. You can write as you go. Is there an interesting story that you really want to tell? Find a focus for your story. What do you hope to achieve in telling the story? Make a list of ideas you want to include. Include a parking area, a document or a folder for other ideas worth pursuing that may not fit in this story. As you write, continue to move ideas here rather than deleting it from the story if it doesn't fit. The more you write, the more ideas will come to mind. Most likely, you aren't going to start by writing a book. You're going to want to start with smaller chunks. Well, how do you find those nuggets? Well, begin with the timeline. Here I've created a timeline of my ancestor, Johann Baptist Jetzer. I have the date that he was born and where, the date that he was married, when he emigrated to America, and then the year that he died in Vernon Township in Richland County. So that's very basic information that you might want to keep in a timeline. Some other things you might want to add are maybe the death of the parents, if they died maybe when he was a child, birth of any siblings, military service, birth of the children, or whether he was widowed or whether they lost a child. From that timeline, you can develop questions generated from your topics. For example, what time of year and what was the weather like when they departed? How did they travel from their home to the port? What did the port look like? What did the ship look like? How many were traveling and their ages? Who were the other shipmates? Were there other Swiss on board? And what did their birth look like? What did they take with them? I know from family history that they had a family Bible that they brought with them. And why did they leave the country? I want to talk a few minutes about narrative nonfiction. By definition, narrative nonfiction tells a story through carefully researched factual recounting. The story ingredients in narrative nonfiction include a specific time and place, the characters, an incident, what prompted you to tell that story, the action, what actually happens in the story, and then some kind of transformation. There's usually a transformation that happens. Either they're leaving the old world and coming to the new world, or something happens because of something in that place and time in history. You also want to appeal to the five senses: taste, hearing, sight, smell, and touch. An ancestor aboard an early ship might have seen the shoreline slipping away, heard the sharp snap as the sails filled the air, felt the water splash over the side of the ship as it rolled in the rough waves, smelled the rain as it began to fall, gently, then soaking his shirt. You also want to include some personal observations, some mannerisms of the persons, the sayings and habits, maybe the way they walked or moved, or the clothing they wore. My grandma Catherine always had a saying, "Oh, go on." If she didn't believe what we were saying, it was, "Oh, go on." I always remember that. And my grandma Elsie, the true Southern woman that she was, she always wore a hat. Use your imagination, but don't make things up. Your writing should come from your research. So now let's talk about weaving historical context into family storytelling. Historical context means studying and situating your ancestors in the context of their surroundings, whether it's time, place, or environment. You'll want to research the community where your family lived. You might want to start with museums and historical societies. Maybe there's one in the town that they lived in, or the county, or the state, or maybe there's a national museum where there might be information about your family. You also want to look at newspaper archives. Nowadays, a lot of the newspaper archives are online. County books and maps are also really great places to look for the history of your family. Maps, especially in the early 1800s, listed the name of the person who owned the property in a certain area. So you want to look for those county maps, those area maps that might have a clue as to where your ancestors lived. Churches are also a great place to find more information. A lot of times you can find birth records, marriage records, baptism records, and death records if they were buried in a local cemetery near the church. Civic groups also, men's and women's clubs. A lot of times in the newspaper archives, you can find information about the different clubs and who belong to them in the society pages of the newspapers. And you'll also want to look at the occupations that people had. There are census records for farms so that you might know how many cattle and how many pigs and how many horses a family had. There are also some great places to look in your syllabus under where to look. Research the era. What was life like for men, for women, for children? If we remember, women just got the right to vote in 1920. So what was life like in the 1800s for them? What rights did they have? How did they gradually gain rights like owning property, a business maybe, and children too? Look at local, national, and global events. What shaped your family? Think about natural disasters. We had a couple of floods in our town and they flooded some businesses. If your ancestor owned one of those businesses, what did they do? Did they rebuild or did they have to learn a new trade? Wars and rebellions are also really important. A lot of immigrants came because of a war in their country, or some women even married military men and came back to America with them. Was yours one of them? And then also think about religious beliefs. There were religions that immigrants came because they were being persecuted. So those are all really important things to think about when you're thinking about your family and their history. Google it. Ask questions. Search for images. You never know what you may find. I was able to find information about my immigrants' ship when they came over just by Googling it. Search for towns, counties, states, countries, surnames. Maybe some of the ancestors settled in other parts of America. Search on subjects and search on occupations. And then just write. I had a professor in college in my travel writing class, which is probably one of the most fun classes I've ever taken, but I also learned so much in that class. She said, write that shitty first draft. It won't be perfect, and that's okay, just write it. You'll want to start with a fact and build on it. Outlines can help you. What information do you want to make sure that you include in that story? And then remember your audience again. What do you think they would want to know? After you've written your first draft, set it aside. I actually write some and then I set it aside for a little bit and then I come back to it and I kind of edit as I go and write some more and then set it aside and come back to it and write some more. That's my style. You may want to just write your whole first draft and then go back and look at it again. But when you pick it up again, do a really critical edit. What can you do to improve the story? What's missing? And you'll definitely want to check your spelling, grammar, punctuation. And then begin to think about the historical context. What happened during that time that influenced the characters? What can you add to the story with historical context? And although we're writing narrative nonfiction, we still want to cite our sources. And some of the reasons that we do that are to move the researchers to analyze the information. And it shows the quality and the quantity of the research that you've done. It also validates your family history, and it helps to find the source again so that you don't keep researching the same thing over and over again. You'll want to remember these basic elements when you're writing citations. Who? The entity that created the work. What? The source title. When? The date the source was created. And where? The place of publication or the location of the source. Some of the different types of citations include the source list, usually called a bibliography, and that's a master list of the documents that you've used in your story. Usually it's listed at the end of the report or the narrative. There's also reference notes. Most of the time we call them endnotes or footnotes, and those identify the source of individual statements in your writing. And then the third one that you might use is called a source label, and that's actually added to an image or an extract or a transcription to explain where you got that information on that individual document. The type of citation you will use depends on who your audience is, where you're going to be submitting your writing. For most people, if you're just writing for your family, you'll probably just want to create a bibliography. It's a master list of the references that are used, and it can be quite lengthy if you're doing it for narrative nonfiction. Even the tiniest snippet of information should be included for the reader to go back and reference. Here's an example of what a bibliography would look like. And I've also included in this bibliography a couple of great places where you can go to find more information on source citations, both from Thomas Jones' book and Elizabeth Shown Mills' book. The citation style that genealogists usually use is called Humanities Style of the Chicago Manual of Style. There's a website for the Chicago Manual of Style. It's a paid site. If you're doing a lot of writing, you might want to get a subscription to them. But you can also usually find cheat sheets at some of the genealogy conferences and on FamilyTreeMagazine.com. So, when is your story finished? Well, we all know a genealogist's work is never done. Even if you're missing a few bits of information or some brick walls, write anyway. You never know. Publishing your work allows other people to view it, and you may find a descendant of the missing person that can help you with your brick wall. So now I want to give you an example of some narrative writing. I've chosen my ancestor that I've talked about through this presentation, Johann Baptist Jetzer. I have information on the family that I've written on a blog, a website on WordPress, JetzerFamilyInAmerica.com. So I pulled a little bit of information that I have on that website, and so you can see, most people in the normal writing in a genealogy style. In 1833, they came along with their sons and daughters, and I have them listed with their ages, and then left from the port of Le Havre, France on the Casimir Perrier, bound for New York. They arrived 29 July 1833, and they made their way to Richland County, now Crawford County, Ohio. Okay, it's got a lot of good information in it, but it's pretty boring, isn't it? It's just a lot of facts and figures to it. So now I'll read my ancestor's story that I've put together based on some information that I've found in my research. Johann Baptist Jetzer perched on one of his family's trunks, which was waiting to be loaded onto the three-masted Casimir Perrier. It was to be their home at sea for the next 2 months. He surveyed the scene. The captain, who looked to be about his age, barked out orders to his crew to load passengers' earthly possessions and the food that would be needed to sustain them for the long trip. The air of the harbor city was ripe with the smell of dead fish. The symphony of voices from Germany, France, Switzerland, and Belgium would be his shipmates on the voyage to America. His eyes settled on his wife of 17 years, Brigitte, and his 6 children, Cecilia, 16, who was minding the baby, Rosina, barely old enough to walk. Son Johann, a bright, curious 14-year-old, watched as the family's possessions, including extra food and their treasured family Bible, were loaded on the ship. Daughters Brigitte, 13, Mary Agatha, 9, and son Leo, 7, amused themselves exploring the dock. He thought about the quaint hamlet back in Switzerland, Vogelsang, and everyone he and the family were leaving. He was 40 and Brigitte 42. Were they making the right decision at their age? Setting sail for a new country was intimidating, but the Casimir, built just 4 years earlier, was very seaworthy, having made the same voyage to New York a year earlier. They would have to learn a new language. They had already spoke French and German, and the children were well educated, so English might not be so hard. Their Swiss friends had just settled on land in Ohio, bought from the government. The dense forest would have to be cleared for a farm, but the children were old enough to help. He thought about the apple trees he could plant so Brigitte could make her wonderful strudel. The final whistle came from the captain, brought him back to reality. It was time to gather the children and board. A new life, a new world awaited. So where did I find all this information? This family record that I was able to get from Switzerland actually shows the date of birth for Johann and the date of birth for Brigitte, known in America as John and Bridget. And it also shows the date of marriage for them as June of 1816. So from there I was able to figure out that that they were married for 17 years and basically their ages. And if you'll look on here too, it says Kinder about halfway down, and some but not all of the children are listed on here. From the ship's log, I was able to find out that the name of the ship was the Casimir Perrier. I was able to figure out who came, John and Brigitte, and then all of the children, and even a baby. Baby Yetzer was Rosina. One really interesting thing about the ship's log is that Leo Yetzer is on there. It's the only record that I have of that child. He's not listed on any of the land deeds after John Baptist died, and so the land deeds that went to the land that went to the children, and he was not one of them. So he either died with or before his father. So it's a really interesting and important piece of information for my family. Also from the ship's log, I was able to decipher that there were people from France, from Germany, from Switzerland, and from Belgium also on the ship. So then I tried to find more information about the actual ship that they came over on, and I was able to find out that it was a 3-masted ship. And some of the voyages that it had taken, the age of the ship, that it was only 4 years old. I also found out that the ship took about 2 months to sail from France to America to New York. And then also really interesting on this website that I found was some of the sailors that were also on the ship. And so from that, I saw that the captain of the ship was born in 1793. And if you remember, that's when John Baptist was born. So they were about the same age. And that's where I got that information from. So how did I know that they brought a Bible with them? Well, here's an article in the Shelby Daily Globe that talks about Leo Yetzer having a Bible that's 148 years old, was printed in Germany. Actually, printed in German is what it really meant. Well, Leo Yetzer was the grandson of John Baptist Yetzer. And in our family, and I guess it's a Swiss custom, that the oldest male in each generation keeps the Bible and protects the Bible until it can be passed on to the next generation. It will be really interesting because the gentleman that has the Bible now has 2 girls. So we're not quite sure how it will get passed down to the next generation from there. But we still have in our family the family Bible. So I was curious about how the family would get from Switzerland to France to board the ship to America. So I Googled it, and I found a book called New Switzerland in Illinois. It was in a collection in the University of Illinois Library, which told some information in general about how Swiss traveled. There were evidently a couple of gentlemen who you could engage in business, and they would take you by wagon through Paris to Le Havre. The article talks about, the book talks about, they gave them meals along the way. The wagons that they took were well equipped with cooking facilities, so they were able to cook while they were on the trip. It talks down a little bit lower. Besides meat, soup, bread, and vegetables daily, each person receives 2 glasses of wine daily when obtainable, and then otherwise good cider. They also arranged for lodging in advance, and the traveler would do well to use his own bedding, for he cannot always find the neatness and cleanliness that he would like. The trip usually takes 20 days. So really interesting information. These 2 men were from the same canton, Aargau. So it's perceivable that they may have used these men or someone similar to arrange their travel from Switzerland to France. I didn't include it in the story because I didn't feel comfortable that this was the mode of travel. So those are the types of things that you have to think about when you're deciding whether to use some information like this. You may be lucky to have your ancestor named in one of the many county books that were written in the 1880s to 1900s. And this is J.B. Yetzer, John Baptist Yetzer, the son, who came over from Switzerland. So there's information about him and the fact that when he was 22, his father died and he had to become the support of the family. He maintained the farm for many years. They had 12 children. A lot of really good information in here that can be woven into another story, really. It talks at the end, he stands high in the community and is one of the best read men of his township. And so that's where I get the impression that, that he was very well read, very well educated in Switzerland before they came to America. So this is another example from the history of Crawford County this time, and a book that was written in the late 1880s, 1900s or so. And it talks about the first settlers that came to the area. So you can see there were some that came in 1832, and then John B. Yetzer and some others came in 1833. So I'm fairly sure that there were some others that either came with him or came before him from Switzerland. I haven't actually researched these names yet. Curiously, there are some settlers to the what we call now the Shelby settlement that's just outside of Shelby in Richland and Crawford County. There was another family called the Suitors, and they owned property on either side of John, and they were also from Switzerland, but they're not listed here, and they came about the same time. The other thing that's really interested in here is that there were French who settled in the area, and there were also Irish who settled in the area in the same time frame, early 1830s. And they're curiously not included as part of the early settlers. So you have to take some of these histories with a grain of salt and realize that you know, they may not have always gotten all of the information. Thank you for joining me today in turning research into family stories. Happy writing!